Alright, I'm refuting the claim made by Marvin Lara that owning a firearm is necessary for protecting yourself. His three claims are that, number one, owning a firearm is the most effective way to protect yourself in your home or a personal business. Number two, more people need to obtain a firearm because you cannot rely on the officers to be on time for calls. Number three, police cannot be relied on to protect us. My first points that I'll be refuting that Marvin claims is that owning a firearm is the most efficient way to protect yourself in your home or personal business. He shows evidence in the Rodney King riots in 1992, where police rioters responded outside a city courthouse due to the court case of Rodney King. The riots lasted for 6 days, and the rioters were not able to be controlled by the police. However, this evidence is outdated because 5 years later, in the North Hollywood shooting in 1987, a similar situation occurred where two bank robbers had robbed a Bank of America, and they were on the run, and the police were not able to penetrate the armor that the robbers were wearing. Subsequent to that, there was a law passed that required police to carry higher powered weapons, and since then, so at the time, they were issued semi-automatic pistols and 12-gauge shotguns, which again were not able to penetrate the armor. Only SWAT teams had capable weapons, so the police then had to go to local gun shops in order to find weapons. After that, they were issued .45 caliber semi-automatic pistols, which the SWAT team also carried, and they were also issued AR-15 rifles, which not only are higher powered, but they enable the officers to use various types of ammo for different situations so that they can penetrate the armor of the suspect, but not penetrate other buildings or not hurt civilians. And then these weapons were also able to be customized after the 1997 incident, adding red dot sights, grips, and suppressors to provide greater accuracy. My second point that I'm refuting is that more people need to obtain a firearm because you cannot rely on the officers to be on time for calls. Marvin showed evidence of this in his claim that police was too slow, and a victim that he talked about was attacked and harmed because of this. This is only a specific instance, and it cannot be covered in the whole grand scheme of things. And just stating that one instance where the police were not quick enough can't cover everything. Christopher S. Coper, a criminologist at George Mason University, reported that faster response times don't necessarily improve offender apprehension because there are often delays in reporting of the crime. He's saying that just because police got a call, they responded to a situation, doesn't mean that the actual criminal is going to get apprehended. A lot of crimes don't actually get reported right away. This is also spoken about by William Spellman, professor at Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, states that about 90% of the calls to police are not reported in a timely manner due to the crime not being reported immediately. So the police cannot get to the call on time just because they're not called right away. Another problem is that they're typically reported as mean times and not as an overall. Mean time covers the overall, however, they should be reported as percentiles. Leonard Matrice, Director of Research and Product Development at the Center for Public Safety Management, states that response times should be based on a percentile than averages. Means or medians don't really help you understand fully what's going on. He says this because to better analyze the data, they have to break it up between how many calls were actually arrived on time in the 70, 80, and 90 percentiles. This shows that calls are actually being responded to, even though most people don't think so. With every police department having different goals for being on time, according to the layout of the city, if you analyze the data in percentiles, police are actually meeting their department goals in response times. And my third point that I'm refuting is that police cannot be relied on to protect us. Marvin shows evidence that high priority calls in Atlanta average over 11 minutes in response time. However, this statistic is false because of according to the Detroit Police Chief, James Craig, cities categorize far more calls as high priority than do other cities. Some police departments have reported up to 90% of calls being high priority when most of them actually aren't. Craig continues to state that many times officers will arrive at the scene and not notify dispatch that they have arrived at the scene. This could be due to the officer's failure to notify dispatch, or it could be the officer has to immediately engage in the situation in order to protect somebody. So that, and then because they're engaging in something, they don't have time to report back to the dispatch. And then in conclusion, the police are there for a reason. And by stating the police are not equipped to help people and stating they're not able to respond fast enough is not accurate. Having a firearm is not necessary to protect oneself. Thank you.
All right, Andrew, you identified the main and secondary claims pretty clearly. There's good signposting in the body of the speech, so it's easy to follow. Most of the time you are giving us claims and then trying to explain those. Some of those times I think you might even want to give some numerical signposts on the claims because you do have multiple responses on some of those points. I do think there's a little bit of confusion at times on some of the arguments. For example, on that first point, you are dismissing the LA riots experience as being old evidence, and then you talk about the bank robbery evidence. The guys with the flak jackets and all that sort of thing. And I kept wondering, okay, now how does this show that having guns by the private citizens isn't useful or is unnecessary? It sounds to me like ultimately the argument here is that the police are now better equipped in order to respond to those crimes. And I guess you're making the inference that the problem in the riots was that the police couldn't respond because they weren't adequately equipped, and now you fix that. I don't think that that's really what the advocates' original argument was. I think their argument was that when citizens armed themselves and took control, they were able to protect themselves and their property, not that the police weren't able to do that because they were inadequately armed. So you're picking around the edges on some of these arguments. I think the same thing is true on the second point, which, by the way, I thought you did an excellent job developing a lot of arguments to kind of take down some of the statistical information that's being used and attack it in an indirect way. I've got a great deal of admiration for the detail that you went into on that, but you do have to make sure that you are also addressing the bigger issue. So, for example, the question about response times not necessarily being the best way to do it, it's the percentiles that we need to talk about, and that mean times misrepresent that information. Okay, that's interesting. However, ultimately, remember the answer is that people are sometimes confronted by armed criminals and the police aren't there. Regardless of how long it takes, they aren't there. And so although I think your argument suggests that the police can be more effective than they're being given credit for, I think you're right that the advocate didn't have a strong piece of information on that. I mean, they had the one example that they cited, and I thought that was a good criticism of that point. But this other thing just feels like, like I said before, you're kind of going around the edges on the argument, and you found good responses to those edge arguments, but I think the bigger picture issue is perhaps still not being as strongly answered as it needs to be. And then the third point, the issue of high priority calls. Again, this one I think works a little bit better because that was what the advocate was talking about there, the shortage amount of time, and that Atlanta PD, I think it was, that was able to respond to the high priority calls. They couldn't do that. Your response comes back and says, well, the truth of the matter is that that's not really a good measure because a lot of things get called high priority when they aren't. Okay, so I think that diminishes the quality of the advocate's evidence on that particular point. Is that enough, though, to undermine, the bigger argument that's being made there? So I think you've got what we would call good tactical arguments, but not necessarily good strategic arguments, because you've got the issues that you're dealing with on a microscopic level, but there's a bigger picture too, and you need to work on getting some issues on those points also. All right, thank you.